Esther. Dear friends, today we are entering the 17th book of the Bible, Esther. Esther is the second of the two books in the Bible that are named after women. With the book of Esther, the books of history in the Bible end. The books Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther talk about what happened after 70 years of Judah's exile. The rest of the 22 books in the Old Testament were written within the time span from creation till now. Now let's get into the book. The book of Esther talks about the people who, in the time of Cyrus, did not return to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel. At this time, Ahasuerus was king of Persia. The empire consisted of 127 provinces and spanned from India to Ethiopia. In his third year, King Ahasuerus gave a feast for all his officials and servants, and he showed the riches of his glory and the splendor of his greatness. And when this was completed, the king gave a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. At this time, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he wanted to showcase his queen's beauty as well. So he sent his 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown. But the queen refused to come at the king's command. At this, the king became enraged. He consulted the wise men on what should be done against this disobedience. They decided to remove Vashti from being queen so that other women, on seeing her conduct, do not disobey their husbands as well. And they did so. After a while, the king's anger subsided. He remembered what Vashti had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's attendants suggested that a search be made for beautiful young virgins. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice pleased the king, and he followed it. Now, in the citadel of Susa, there was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, and his cousin Hadassah, who was also known as Esther. When the king's order had been proclaimed, many girls were brought into the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther was also taken with them. She was lovely in form and features. As she had neither father nor mother, Mordecai took her as his own daughter and raised her. And Esther did not reveal her nationality or family background to anyone because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Each girl who was brought in had to undergo 12 months of beauty treatment. Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. So, in the 7th year of King Ahasuerus, Esther was taken to the king. The king was attracted to Esther more than to any other woman. She won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Though Esther had become queen, she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions, as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, he found 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway conspiring to assassinate the king. He told it to Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And the report was investigated and found to be true. And the 2 officials were hanged on gallows. All these were recorded in the book of the Chronicles. After these events, King Ahasuerus honored Haman the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. Do you remember Agag? Agag was the king of the Amalekites, who long back had unreasonably attacked the Israelites, who came out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses. Haman was a descendant of this Agag, and the king commanded everyone to kneel down and pay honor to Haman. But Mordecai did not kneel down or pay him honor. Mordecai, being a Jew, did not want to kneel down to anyone else except the Lord. This enraged Haman. On learning that Mordecai was a Jew, Haman looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of King Ahasuerus. When he got an opportunity, he misled the king and acquired a decree for the annihilation of the Jews. The king accepted Haman's request and took his signet ring and gave it to Haman. Haman cast lots for each day of the month, from the first month of Nisan to the 12th month of Adar, and the lot fell on the month of Adar. So in the 12th year of Ahasuerus, in the 13th day of the first month, Haman wrote a decree and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent it to all the provinces of Persia, and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the people, with instructions to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. With the issuing of this decree, the city of Susa was thrown into confusion, and in every province wherever the king's command and his decree had reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. Many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Mordecai's situation was no different. When Esther's servants told her about this, she inquired about why he was doing this. In reply, Mordecai sent with the eunuch Hathach knowledge of Haman's plot, the situation of the Jews, and a copy of the royal edict. He also commanded her to go to the king, to beg his favor and to plead with him on behalf of her people. Esther, who had always followed Mordecai's instructions, was now a little hesitant, because no one, not even the queen, was allowed to go to the king unless he called them. In case someone did go, the law stated that unless the king had mercy and stretched out his golden scepter towards that person, they must die. But Mordecai opposed Esther remaining silent because of this. Mordecai advised her that she might have come to this position for such a time as this, and so she must not stay silent. Then, on Esther's request, all the Jews in Susa fasted for 3 days. She and her young women did the same. Then, after the 3rd day, she went to the king and stood in the inner court. And when the king saw Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out towards her the golden scepter that was in his hand, and asked her what she wanted. Esther asked the king and Haman to come to the feast that she had prepared. The king agreed to that. So the king and Haman went to the feast Esther had prepared. There Esther asked the both of them to come to her feast the next day also. Then Haman went home joyful and glad that Esther had called only the king and him to the feast. But when Haman saw Mordecai sitting at the king's gate, showing no respect to him, he was filled with wrath. Haman went home and recounted to his friends and his wife how the king had honored him and placed him above all the officials, and about the feast that Queen Esther had prepared only for him and the king. Yet he said that all of this was worth nothing, so long as he saw Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. As a solution for this, his wife and friends suggested that a gallows be made, and the next day to tell the king to hang Mordecai on it. This idea pleased Haman. So he had the gallows made. He decided to hang Mordecai before going to the feast tomorrow. But that night the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles to be brought in and read to him. In it, they read that Mordecai had exposed 2 of the gatekeepers who had conspired to assassinate the king. The king asked what honor and recognition Mordecai had received for this. His servants answered that nothing had been done for him. He decided to correct himself and asked who was standing in the court. Now Haman had just entered the outer court to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had erected for him. In reply to the king, his servants answered that Haman was in the court. The king ordered him to come in. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What must be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Haman thought to himself that the king wanted to honor him and suggested a good idea. This was the idea. For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." In reply to this, the king commanded Haman to do everything he had said for Mordecai who sits at the king's gate. Haman had no choice but to obey. After carrying out the king's orders, Haman rushed home covered in grief. When his wife and friends heard this, they began to realize that Mordecai was a Jew and that defeating him was impossible. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs came and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And as they were drinking wine, the king asked Esther what her petition and request was. She asked for her life as her petition and her people as her request. She told the king that Haman had sold her and her people for destruction. When the king learned of Esther's background and Haman's schemes, he was filled with rage against Haman. Haman, realizing that the king had decided his fate, begged Queen Esther for his life. But there was no use. When the king realized that Haman had even built a gallows for Mordecai who had saved his life, he had Haman hanged on the same gallows. The king's servants did so, and his fury subsided. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. But the problem of the Jews was not solved here. So Esther pleaded with the king to write an order revoking the letters which Haman had written and sealed with the king's signet ring. But an edict written in the king's name and sealed with his ring could not be revoked. So the king told her that they could write another edict for the Jews and seal it with the king's ring. Then under Mordecai another edict was written in favor of the Jews and sealed with the king's signet ring, and sent to all the 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. The edict allowed the Jews, on the day that Haman planned to destroy them, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any people of province that might attack them, women and children included, and to plunder their goods. And in every province and every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the people declared themselves Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So on the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all people. Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all provinces. So many people helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies. The situation in Susa, the citadel, was no different. The Jews killed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. When the king heard the news, he asked Esther if she had any further request, and said that it will be granted. Esther asked for one more day to be given for the Jews in Susa to destroy their enemies. The king granted her request. And the Jews who were in Susa gathered together again on the 14th day and killed 300 men, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On the 14th day, the remainder of the Jews in the kingdom, and on the 15th, the Jews in Susa, rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Queen Esther and Mordecai sent letters saying that these days should be called Purim and celebrated as a feast, and they celebrate it to this day. Mordecai was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of the people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. With this we come to the end of the book of Esther. We also come to the end of the 3,500 years of history from the time of creation. In the next story we will go into the next book. God bless you.